What actually happens to evolution when it gets shipwrecked? Cut off on a scrap of rock in the middle of the ocean with no road back to the mainland? On real islands, the answer turns strange, fast. Elephants shrink down to the size of cattle, rats swell up to the size of house cats, and entire species of birds quietly forget how to fly. Picture washing up on a beach like that yourself, 1,000 kilometers from anywhere familiar. Nothing there chose to become strange, it just landed somewhere. The old survival rules stopped applying. An island looks like ordinary land from a map, but evolution treats it as a sealed experiment, limited space, unusual opportunities, and no easy way out once you're in. The moment a population gets stranded there, distance starts cutting its genetic ties to the world it came from, generation by generation. Mutations that would have failed instantly back on the mainland can suddenly turn useful, or at least harmless enough to stick around. That's the engine behind almost everything strange about island wildlife. The odd sizes, the shrunken wings, the diets nobody back home would recognize. Biologists even gave the size pattern a name, the island rule. Big animals tend to shrink, small ones tend to grow. It's a tendency, not a law. Researchers still argue about how far it stretches, but the pressure driving it is completely real. For a large animal arriving from the mainland, the first problem is almost always food. An island simply has fewer plants, smaller feeding grounds, and nowhere to migrate to when supplies run thin. A smaller body needs fewer calories, reaches maturity faster, and can keep an entire population alive on resources that would barely feed a handful of giants. So generation after generation, the individuals that grow a little less leave a few more descendants, and the whole population drifts smaller. That's exactly how dwarf elephants ended up scattered across Mediterranean islands during the last ice age, descended from ancestors many times their eventual size. Their fossils preserve the whole transformation. The skeleton of a full-grown elephant compressed into an animal that could cross in a few strides what its ancestors once needed to march for miles. Dwarf mammoths pulled off the same trick even later, surviving on islands. California's Channel Islands, Russia's Wrangel Island, long after their mainland relatives had already died out. Getting smaller wasn't decline, it was the correct answer to a world where the real challenge was keeping a huge body fed on very little land. Predators changed the math too. The bulk that once scared off mainland carnivores stops earning its keep the moment those carnivores simply aren't there anymore. Once size costs more in food than it saves in safety, natural selection starts quietly trimming it down. Small mainland animals get the opposite deal: fewer predators, fewer competitors, and suddenly a lot of open ecological space to grow into. A rodent that spent its whole evolutionary history hiding can now afford to get bigger, wander farther, chew on tougher food, and hold a much wider territory. Without constant pressure to breed fast before something eats you, slower growth and longer lifespans start becoming possible options too. On the island of Flores, giant rats evolved right alongside a whole cast of unusual animals, quietly filling roles that bigger mammals would have taken elsewhere. Oversized rodents, lizards, insects, pigeons, tortoises, islands around the planet keep producing giants, though each lineage got there through its own particular mix of pressures. Giant tortoises are the most famous case, mostly because their slow metabolism lets them ride out droughts that would kill almost anything else. Their size stores energy and water for the lean stretches, and a shell that thick means an adult has almost nothing left to fear once the local predators are gone. On the Galápagos and on Aldabra, these reptiles turned into more than oversized versions of mainland tortoises. They became one of the main forces holding those ecosystems together. They trample paths through dense growth, scatter seeds across long distances, clear out overgrown vegetation, and shift nutrients around the landscape, doing work grazing mammals would handle on a continent. Size is just the most visible layer, though. Isolation reshapes how an animal moves, eats, breeds, and senses danger just as thoroughly. Flight is the clearest example. Wings are exactly what gets you to a remote island, and exactly what stops paying for itself once you've arrived. Flying costs a fortune in muscle, hollow bones, and constant fuel, all built around an ability that may no longer buy you any real protection. If there's food on the ground and nothing hunting from the air, individuals that fly less can put that saved energy straight into growth, breeding, or simply staying alive. Over enough generations, wings shorten, flight muscles fade, and a lineage that once crossed oceans on the wing ends up permanently grounded. Rails, an entire bird family, famous for reaching the most remote islands on Earth, have pulled off this exact trick independently over and over again. New Zealand pushed the pattern to its limit, going millions of years without a single native land mammal apart from bats. Every role a browsing mammal, a burrowing mammal, or a ground predator would normally fill sat wide open, so birds simply moved into it. The moa grew into giant flightless grazers, and the enormous Haast's eagle evolved to hunt them straight out of the sky. The kakapo became a heavy, nocturnal, flightless parrot, while the kiwi grew powerful legs, tiny useless wings, hair like feathers, and a nose at the very tip of its beak for sniffing out grubs underground. None of that reads as failure once you see it clearly. Every strange feature was custom built for a world that simply never had mammals in it. The famous island fearlessness runs on the same logic. There's no payoff in staying alert for predators that haven't existed for thousands of generations. The dodo of Mauritius belonged to the pigeon family, and isolation turned its ancestors into a large, ground-dwelling bird with wings too small to matter. That body made perfect sense back home, in a place where outrunning land predators counted for far less than simply living efficiently on the island itself. So imagine walking up to one on a beach that had never seen a human before. What later got mocked as stupidity was really just evolutionary confidence, built over a stretch of time nothing had ever disturbed. Islands don't only remove danger. They strip away competitors, pollinators, scavengers, parasites, and countless other relationships that quietly shape life on a continent. The result is what biologists call a disharmonious ecosystem, some groups thriving in force while others are missing almost entirely. Getting there in the first place is its own filter. The ocean crossing sorts potential colonists by size, behavior, tolerance, and sheer luck. Birds, bats, insects, spiders, seeds, and small reptiles can arrive on the wing, in a storm, on a raft of floating debris, or by pure accident, all far easier routes than swimming a continent's worth of ocean. A single pregnant lizard clinging to a mat of uprooted trees can found an entire lineage, the same way one seed carried inside a bird's gut can start a forest from scratch. Almost every traveler dies along the way. Evolution runs on the rare, improbable one that lands somewhere livable and actually manages to breed. That founder only carries a slice of the original population's genetic variety, so the new colony is different from the very first generation. Random genetic quirks spread fast in a population that small and that cut off from any later arrivals. From there, natural selection works with whatever limited material it's got, tuning descendants to the local climate, food, disease, competitors, and terrain. If that island happens to offer several different habitats, one arriving lineage can split into many separate species instead of staying a single generalist. That branching out process, adaptive radiation, is what turns a single lucky arrival into a whole burst of biological variety. The Galápagos finches are the textbook case. Charles Darwin noticed related populations there evolving beaks shaped for completely different foods, from seeds to insects to cactus flesh. The real lesson was never the beaks themselves, it's that one ancestral arrival split into a dozen different ways of making a living. Hawaiian honeycreepers took it even further, radiating into an almost absurd range of bills built for probing flowers, crushing seeds, peeling bark, and hunting insects. Some of them look so different from each other that you'd never guess they share an ancestor just by looking. Madagascar plays out the same idea on a much bigger stage, its long isolation letting arriving lineages diversify across an island nearly the size of a continent. Lemurs spread out into lifestyles that monkeys, squirrels, sloths, and grazing mammals fill elsewhere, ranging from tiny nocturnal mouse lemurs all the way to now extinct giants the size of a gorilla. Tenrecs diversified into forms that look almost exactly like hedgehogs, shrews, moles, and otters, despite sharing no close ancestry with any of them at all. That's convergent evolution at work. Proof that evolution doesn't invent from nothing. It reshapes whatever happens to already be there until it fits the job available. Caribbean anal lizards did something similar, repeatedly evolving matching body types for tree trunks, thin twigs, open grass, and forest canopy on separate islands independently. The same habitat specialists kept turning up with nearly identical limb lengths, toe pads, and body proportions, no matter which island they evolved on. A lizard sprinting across a wide trunk simply needs different proportions than one balancing on a narrow twig, so the terrain itself ends up written into the skeleton. Isolation doesn't only invent new forms, it can also preserve old ones, especially once a lineage's mainland relatives get wiped out by competition, climate, or predators. New Zealand's Tuatara is exactly that, the last living branch of a reptile group that once spread across a much wider stretch of the planet. An island can work as an evolutionary workshop and a refuge at the same time, inventing brand new bodies while quietly sheltering fragments of a much older world. Even behavior can drift into unexpected territory once animals run into chances their ancestors never had. A species might shift where it nests, become active at a different time of day, widen its diet, or simply drop defensive instincts that stopped paying off generations ago. Plants go through equally strange transformations, though it's a lot less obvious to anyone just passing through. Herbaceous mainland plants can turn genuinely woody on an island, where long growing seasons, mild winters, and steady competition seem to favor taller, longer-lived growth. Seeds sometimes shed the very structures that once let them ride the wind, because on an island, drifting too far usually just means falling into the ocean. Flowers reshape themselves around whichever few pollinators are actually available, building tight, specialized partnerships with one particular bird, bat, moth, or lizard. Some island plants grow unusually large, unusually long-lived, or unusually undefended, simply because the grazers that would have punished those traits elsewhere never showed up. Every one of these changes ripples outward, because an island ecosystem isn't a pile of separate curiosities, it's a network built from a very small cast of characters. When a single bird becomes a plant's main pollinator, that plant's entire future gets tied to the bird's migration, feeding habits, and survival. When giant tortoises disappear as seed dispersers, the plants they used to carry across the landscape can lose their only way of spreading it all. Seabirds link land and ocean directly, feeding far offshore and then depositing nutrient-rich waste back on land, essentially importing marine fertility straight into island soil. Those nutrients feed plants, insects, and reptiles, and can even reach nearby coral reefs. Deep ocean food webs quietly wired into the forest above the shoreline. An island's edge turns out to be far leakier than it looks, with wind, currents, migration, and storms constantly moving energy and life across it. What actually matters is that those crossings stay rare and selective enough to keep the isolation intact, instead of letting the island slowly turn into a copy of the mainland. Distance sharpens the effect, and so do ocean depth, current direction, climate, island size, and simply how long that piece of land has stayed cut off. A larger island can support more habitats and bigger populations, while a smaller one magnifies scarcity and raises the odds that one bad event wipes out an entire lineage. Volcanic islands start out as bare rock, which means every native land organism there had to descend from something that crossed open ocean to get there in the first place. Continental islands can carry older passengers instead, ones inherited from back when rising water or shifting geology split the land off from a much bigger mass. Different origin stories, same underlying lesson, separation turns an ordinary population into an independent experiment. Human evolution might even have an island chapter of its own, though the details stay genuinely uncertain and heavily argued. On Flores, researchers uncovered fossils of a small-bodied hominin in 2003, buried alongside evidence of the island's own strange prehistoric fauna. Several explanations have been floated for its size and ancestry, island dwarfing among them, but the exact path it took is still unresolved. Flores makes the underlying pressures clear either way. Limited resources and long isolation had already produced dwarf elephant relatives and giant rodents there long before humans entered the picture. The island never randomly shrank every big animal and grew every small one. It simply rewarded whatever traits fit a species' particular needs, history, and available role, which is exactly why the island rule counts as a strong tendency rather than a machine that spits out guaranteed results. Some large animals stayed large, some small ones shrank even further, and plenty of populations changed in ways that have nothing to do with body size at all. Evolution never owed anyone an elegant solution, only forms that manage to reproduce under whatever conditions actually exist. A trait can spread just because it saves a sliver of energy, trims one specific danger, opens up new food, or costs nothing serious in a small enough population. Chance matters just as much, especially once storms, eruptions, droughts, or disease repeatedly crash a population down to a handful of survivors. Every strange island creature comes out of that same mix, selection and accident working together, never one without the other. That specialization can work brilliantly for as long as old conditions hold, and leave a species dangerously exposed the moment those conditions change. A bird that lost flight generations ago can't regrow its wings overnight when a new predator shows up, and fearlessness doesn't reverse in a handful of generations either. Humans arrived carrying rats, cats, dogs, pigs, goats, snakes, insects, diseases, and plants, none of which any native island species had ever had a reason to resist. Rats went straight for eggs and chicks that had never once learned to hide from anything like them. Cats picked off ground-nesting birds that had spent thousands of generations in a world with no predators at all. Goats stripped entire hillsides bare, while introduced diseases moved through populations carrying no inherited resistance whatsoever. In ecological terms, this wasn't a gradual shift. It was a sudden collision between species built by two completely separate evolutionary histories. The same isolation that produced these unique animals also trapped them, since a creature confined to one island simply has nowhere else to go once its habitat collapses. Most island species already run on small ranges and small populations, so a single cyclone, fire, invasive predator, or bulldozer can be enough to finish the job. That's a big part of why islands hold such a disproportionate share of both the planet's endemic species and its recorded extinctions. The dodo became the symbol of it, vanishing from Mauritius by around 1681, but its story repeated across rails, pigeons, parrots, tortoises, and lizards on islands everywhere. Some species disappeared before anyone ever got the chance to study them, leaving only bones, scattered fragments, and ecosystems still bent into the shape of their absence. A forest can survive losing its biggest seed disperser and still, quietly, stop replacing the very trees whose seeds that animal used to carry. The extinction itself can happen fast. The ecological fallout can take centuries to fully play out. Island conservation, then, means more than protecting individual species. The missing relationships between them often need rebuilding too. Clearing invasive predators off an island can let seabirds and ground nesters return, sometimes triggering dramatic recoveries inside a carefully guarded patch of habitat. Bringing back tortoises or ecological stand-ins for them can revive the grazing, seed spreading, and vegetation patterns that vanished along with the original giants. These projects tend to work best when they treat the island as one connected system, not a museum shelf of rare specimens. All of it points to something bigger. Strange bodies are answers to specific relationships, shortages, freedoms, and threats a species happen to run into. A dwarf elephant makes sense the moment food runs short. A giant rat makes sense once competition goes quiet. A flightless bird makes sense once the ground stays safe. Strip that context away and adaptation looks like deformity. Put it back, and every strange feature reads like a record of the exact world that built it. Islands make that record unusually easy to read, because their edges box evolutionary cause and effect into a space small enough to actually see. They show how fast a familiar body can pull apart once a population stops swapping genes with anyone else and starts answering only to its own surroundings. They're also a warning against assuming ecosystems come in one natural arrangement. Mammals locked into certain jobs while birds, reptiles, or insects stay permanently shut out of others. Given enough isolation, a pigeon can turn into a heavy ground forager, a parrot can live like a nocturnal grazer, and a tortoise can end up shaping an entire landscape on its own. So the next time something looks bizarre from where you're standing, remember, an island isn't just a place where evolution builds strange creatures, it's a place where you can finally see that strange was only ever adaptation, viewed from the wrong shore.